Is there good historical evidence that Jesus rose bodily from the dead? Yes. Is that evidence the Bible tells me so? No. In this video, I'm going to summarize the argument for the resurrection of Jesus that Dr. Michael Rhoda lays out in his book, Taking Pascal's Wager. This argument won't require you to accept the Bible as inerrant or even inspired. Instead, it will rely only on historical facts that are agreed upon by virtually all scholars who study the topic, theists, atheists, agnostics alike. If that interests you, then stick around. Let's begin with what we'll call the minimal facts. Again, these are facts that are considered historical by a nearly unanimous consensus of modern scholars, regardless of their religious background or worldview. Fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2, very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected. Fact number 3, within a few years after Jesus' death, Paul converted after experiencing what he interpreted as a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to him. So, what's the evidence for minimal fact number 1? Jesus' execution is attested to by Jewish historian Josephus, writing in AD 94, Roman historian Tacitus, writing in AD 115, and it's presupposed in criticisms of Christianity. For example, Celsus, writing in the 2nd century. For these and many other reasons, virtually all scholars agree with minimal fact number 1. So what's the evidence for minimal fact number 2 and number 3? Let's begin with two undisputed letters of Paul, 1 Corinthians and Galatians. Based on the chronology Paul lays out in Galatians 1 and 2, scholars think Paul joined the early Christian movement 2 or 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Most scholars think Jesus died in AD 30, so let's say Paul's conversion happened in AD 33. Paul then says he went to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, which would be AD 36, and met with Peter and James, the Lord's brother. Then he says that 14 years later, which would be AD 50, he went back to Jerusalem, met with Peter, James, and John, and told them the gospel message that he had been preaching. He said he did this to make sure he hadn't run in vain, meaning he wanted to make sure he wasn't preaching the wrong thing. Paul says they added nothing to me and gave him the right hand of fellowship, meaning they endorsed his message and ministry. But we don't just have to take Paul's word for it here. Paul's claim is confirmed by Clement of Rome and Polycarp. According to Irenaeus and others, Clement of Rome was discipled by Peter, and Polycarp was discipled by John. Clement of Rome wrote that Paul and Peter were the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church. Obviously, Clement wouldn't have said this if Paul taught a radically different message than Peter. Similarly, Polycarp wrote that Paul taught accurately and faithfully the word of truth. He wouldn't have done this if Paul had taught a radically different message than John. So this means we have good evidence that Paul, Peter, James, and John were all preaching the same basic message about Jesus in the first 2 decades after Jesus' death. So what was this basic message? We are told in another undisputed letter of Paul, 1 Corinthians. Pause the video and read these verses. You'll notice that here Paul is giving the gospel message, and that gospel message includes Christ's death, his burial, his resurrection, his appearances to Cephas, the 12, more than 500 at the same time, James, all the apostles, and then last of all, Paul himself. Paul could not have claimed that the resurrected Jesus made all these appearances to individuals and groups if Peter, James, and John had never actually claimed such things. Clement, Polycarp, and other early Christian writers would have been quick to point out that Paul lied about what Peter and John really said. For these and other reasons, virtually all scholars agree with minimal facts 2 and 3. So how do we best explain these 3 minimal facts? Well, one possibility is that Paul, Peter, James, and John, and many others, all lied when they claimed to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. Call this the Deceivers Hypothesis. This isn't a very good explanation, though, for at least 3 reasons. First, people lie when they have incentive to. But in this case, the incentives are all wrong. By lying, they had very much to lose and virtually nothing to gain. On the one hand, proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus exposed early Christians to severe persecution and the danger of death. On the other hand, Paul, Peter, and the other apostles appear to have benefited little, in worldly terms, from their leadership positions in the early church. Second, if the resurrection story had been a lie, it would have involved the conspiracy of many people. And we would expect that when these conspirators were faced with the threat of imprisonment and death, at least one of them would have spilled the beans. But there is no evidence that this took place, despite the fact that the early opponents of Christianity, like Celsus, Porphyry, and Julian, whose writings we still have today, would have strong incentive to report such facts. Third, in the case of Paul, we can get a good sense of his character from his undisputed letters left to us. And as Richard Swinburne says, no one can read the more personal letters without getting the very strong impression that Paul is totally honest and generally a very compassionate man, willing to rebuke those who he thinks have been deceitful. So the Deceivers Hypothesis isn't a very good one. Another possibility is that the early witnesses of the resurrection were sincerely deceived. Let's call this the Deceived Hypothesis. They believed Jesus had appeared to them, but these appearances were simply hallucinations. Modern scholars like Gerd Ludemann and Michael Goulder have defended this hypothesis. But the hallucination hypothesis suffers from 3 serious problems. First, though healthy people sometimes have a hallucination of a recently deceased loved one while they grieve, these hallucinations don't lead them to believe that the dead loved one is alive again and embodied. It's interpreted as a brief visitation of the spirit of the dead loved one. But the disciples interpreted their experiences very differently, suggesting that whatever they experienced must have gone far beyond that of a typical bereavement hallucination. And this is confirmed by the fact that the disciples claimed that an individual resurrection had occurred in history, even though it was completely contrary to their pre-existing religious belief in a general resurrection at the end of the world. Second, if the resurrection appearances were hallucinations, then the disciples experienced group hallucinations. And this is absurdly improbable. Hallucinations are mental events with no external reality, and in that sense are similar to dreams. Would we even entertain the idea that 500 people dreamed the same dream at once and say it happened naturally? A more probable version would involve one member of the group, say Peter, having a hallucination, and the others saying they had the same hallucination because of self-delusion. But it's really unlikely that the false claims of those group members, who didn't really have hallucinations but said they did, would have survived the pressures of persecution. It also doesn't explain very well the different appearances at different times. Paul mentions 6 appearances, and even if only one person had a genuine hallucination on each of the 6 occasions, you're still left with the improbable event of 6 hallucinations of the same dead person to different individuals, and each of those hallucinations being so vivid that it resulted in a firm conviction that the dead person had risen from the dead. Third, what about Jesus' body? Even if the apostles had concluded on the basis of hallucinations that Jesus was raised from the dead, they proclaimed his resurrection in the very same city where Jesus was crucified, and the new Christian movement flourished there. Surely the opponents of this early Christian movement would have been quick to squash it by producing Jesus' corpse, but this never happened. So it turns out that for the hallucination hypothesis to work, you have to add a claim about the body. Now, either it was buried or it was not buried. If buried, then the opponents of Christianity would likely have known where and produced a corpse. Even if the corpse was unrecognizable, the burden of proof would have been on anyone who said that these were not Jesus' remains. Since no corpse was produced, the burial place was likely empty. Of course, one could add another claim that the burial place was empty because the body was stolen. The Roman and Jewish authorities wouldn't have stolen it. They wanted Jesus dead. And even if they had stolen it, they would have produced the body after the disciples began proclaiming the resurrection. The disciples aren't good candidates either, because that would mean they were intentionally lying when they proclaimed the resurrection. And we already saw 3 reasons to reject the Deceivers Hypothesis. That would leave some third party, like grave robbers, to steal Jesus' body. But grave robbers would have been interested in valuables buried with the body, like the linen shroud, for example, not the body itself. And they would have had no reason to take the body with them once they had stripped it of its valuables. So without a good candidate for theft, it's unlikely the body was stolen. And that means the hallucination hypothesis provides no good explanation of how the burial place got empty. But the proponent of the hallucination hypothesis could claim that the body wasn't buried. As Bart Ehrman points out, the common Roman practice was to allow the bodies of crucified people to decompose on the cross and be attacked by scavengers as part of the disincentive for crime. There are many strong reasons to think Jesus was buried, though. For the sake of time, I'm only going to mention one. Jesus' burial is reported in extremely early, independent sources, which likely go back to eyewitness testimony. What sources are these? The oral tradition we already discussed, that's recorded in 1 Corinthians 15 and dates to within the first 6 years of the crucifixion, explicitly includes the claim that he was buried. And the source material Mark uses for his account of Jesus' passion dates to no later than AD 37, and explicitly includes the claim that Jesus' body was wrapped in a linen shroud and placed in a tomb. With sources this early, along with the presence of eyewitnesses who could check out the claim that Jesus was buried, it just isn't likely to be legendary. In fact, if Jesus' burial was legendary, we would expect to find an early conflicting tradition in Jewish polemic, but we don't. Instead, the earliest Jewish polemic we find assumes that Jesus was buried and his tomb was empty. So, to sum up, the distinctive reaction of the disciples to their post-resurrection experiences of Jesus, the improbability of group hallucinations, and the difficulties of explaining what happened to Jesus' body end up making the hallucination hypothesis very unlikely. So the deceived hypothesis isn't a very good one either. But if the disciples weren't deceivers and they weren't deceived, the best explanation left is the traditional one. Jesus rose from the dead. Now at this point, there are 2 common objections. We'll call these the improbability objection and the spiritual resurrection objection. Let's start with the improbability objection. Here's how it goes. A resurrection would be a miracle. And no matter how improbable the alternative naturalistic explanations are, a miracle is the most improbable of all. So a resurrection is the most unlikely explanation. How can we respond? Clearly, if God exists and wanted Jesus to rise from the dead, God could make that happen. So whether we should accept the improbability objection or not depends on how likely it is that God exists and how likely it is that if God exists, Jesus would be resurrected. This means that background information is relevant to the assessment of Jesus' resurrection. If it were nearly certain that God does not exist, then it would be correct to reject the historical argument for Christianity on the grounds that the resurrection is simply too improbable. But we don't have anything like near certainty that God does not exist. Instead, we saw in the previous videos that the existence of God is quite plausible. So the crucial question becomes, if God does exist, is it plausible that Jesus would have been resurrected? Yes. Now, why do I say that? Well, humanity has a problem. Each of us is inclined toward harmful and morally wrong actions. There's a big difference between who we are and who we should be. So what could God do about this problem? We've already seen in the previous video that stripping us of our free will isn't the answer. Without it, we lose the opportunity to freely love what is good for its own sake. But God could solve the problem by becoming incarnate. By that, I just mean taking on a human nature. But how would becoming incarnate solve the problem? Well, first, it would provide us with a moral example to show us, not just tell us, how a human life ought to be lived. Second, becoming incarnate would provide God with the opportunity to share in our sufferings, much like a parent who voluntarily joins in her child's suffering to demonstrate her solidarity and love for the child. A good example of this would be parents who shave their head when their children goes bald due to chemotherapy. And third, it's plausible that God might want to become incarnate to bring atonement through his work on earth, reconciling humans with himself. So if God exists, he might very well choose to become incarnate. But what would we expect God incarnate to be like and do? We would expect him to live a holy life and provide powerful teaching about how we can be united with God and become good, in order to pass this teaching on to future generations. We might expect God incarnate to found a church, a community of people who share in living out and passing on these teachings. We would also expect God incarnate to share in our sufferings. And finally, we might expect God incarnate to demonstrate the truth of these teachings by performing at least one miracle. For example, if God incarnate is put to death, something not terribly unlikely given the content of his or her teachings, the miracle of a resurrection would be a fitting divine signature. Now that we've seen some good reasons God would have to become incarnate, and some implications for how we would expect God incarnate to act, we can ask if anyone in history fits this profile. Does Jesus? That's what the historical evidence suggests. Even if we view the Gospels critically, it's beyond reasonable doubt that Jesus lived a holy life, provided powerful teachings about God and humankind, founded a church, was put to death after experiencing great suffering, and he and his followers understood his death as a sacrifice for sin. So, Jesus matches the profile. But it is equally important to note that no one else in history comes close to matching this profile. If any human being was God incarnate, Jesus was most likely that human being. The point then is that the improbability objection to Jesus' resurrection fails. Jesus' resurrection isn't improbable if God exists and wanted Jesus raised from the dead. It's not improbable that God exists, and we just saw several reasons to think that it's not improbable that God would want Jesus raised from the dead. Now let's consider the spiritual resurrection objection. Basically, this objection says the earliest Christians thought of Jesus' resurrection as something non-physical, an event not involving the raising of his corpse. And these earliest Christians used resurrection in a metaphorical way to indicate their sense of the continued presence and power of Jesus with them. Scholars who raise this objection typically appeal to Paul's statements in 1 Corinthians 15. There, Paul describes the kind of bodies believers will be given at Christ's return. In verse 44, he calls these resurrection bodies soma pneumatikon, which gets translated into English as spiritual body. And he contrasts that with the bodies believers now have, which he calls soma psychikon, and this gets translated into English as natural body. These scholars also emphasize the fact that Paul does not explicitly mention an empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15. So they conclude that Paul didn't think of Jesus' resurrection body as a physical one. And since he checked his teachings with Peter, James, and John, and they endorsed his message, the earliest Christians shared Paul's view that Jesus' resurrection was spiritual, not physical. So, how can we respond? First, let's look more closely at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 44. Paul's language of a natural versus a spiritual body, or psychikos versus pneumatikos body, is not speaking of a material substance, but rather a moral or spiritual orientation. It's similar today to when you call someone a spiritual person. You don't mean that they are not physical. You simply mean that they have a virtuous character and they're mindful of religious beliefs. Paul's understanding of spiritual in this sense is evident from his use of the same contrast in terms in 1 Corinthians 2:14, where he describes different sorts of people in Corinth. He says some of them are natural and some of them are spiritual. It is absolutely plain that Paul doesn't think there are people in Corinth who are immaterial. Rather, he's contrasting those with sinful appetites, natural, to those with the Spirit who hunger for righteousness, spiritual. Second, Paul believed that Jesus' resurrection preceded and was the model for the future resurrection of believers. To see this for yourself, pause the video and read for yourself what Paul wrote about the future resurrection of believers. Paul writes in his letter to the Philippians that Jesus will transform these humble bodies of ours into the likeness of his glorious body. And in Romans, he writes, Moreover, if the Spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, the one who raised Christ from the dead will also make your mortal bodies alive through his Spirit who lives in you. And this last statement fits nicely with what we know about Paul. Paul belonged to the tradition of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees very explicitly expected a future bodily resurrection of the members of God's people. So, if Jesus' resurrection is the model for the resurrection of God's people, and the resurrection of God's people will be bodily, then it follows that in Paul's view, Jesus' resurrection was bodily too. And this explains why Paul didn't feel the need to explicitly mention the empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul does explicitly say that Jesus was buried and that he was raised on the third day. Given Paul's physical understanding of the resurrection, his statement that Jesus was raised implies an empty tomb. So where does this leave us? Well, we saw that there are 3 minimal facts that virtually all scholars who study the topic agree on, theist, agnostic, and atheist alike. Fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2, very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples had experiences that led them to believe and proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected. Fact number 3, within a few years after Jesus' death, Paul converted after experiencing what he interpreted as a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to him. We then evaluated 3 possible explanations for those facts. The Deceivers Hypothesis and the Deceived Hypothesis didn't explain those facts as well as the original explanation, that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. We then considered 2 objections to the resurrection hypothesis. The first was the improbability objection, which claimed that the resurrection is the most unlikely explanation of all since it's a miracle. We responded by pointing out that if God exists and wanted Jesus to be raised from the dead, then the resurrection of Jesus would not be improbable. And we saw several reasons to think it's quite plausible that God exists and would want to raise Jesus from the dead. Last, we considered the spiritual resurrection objection, which tried to show that the earliest Christians didn't think of the resurrection as something that happened to the physical corpse. But we saw that Paul repeatedly taught that Jesus' resurrection is the model for the resurrection of God's people, and God's people will be raised bodily, so Jesus was raised bodily too. The claim that Jesus rose bodily from the dead remains the best explanation of the minimal facts. And this means there is solid historical evidence for the truth of Christianity. And where does that leave us? Well, in the next and final video, I'll sum up and evaluate Rhoda's original argument that I presented in the first video in this series. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing. See you soon.